Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm your host today. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors. We've been advocating for peace and justice for over a decade. I'm joined today by Connie Houde. Connie is a longtime activist and a photojournalist, and her pictures are absolutely wonderful. I'm so delighted to have you here today, Connie.
Thank you for asking me. I'm delighted to be here.
Good. Well, let's start out and find out a little bit about your background first. How did you become a photojournalist and an activist? Could you tell us?
More or less by accident. In college, I was not very active in politics. I didn't see a reason for it. I always used my camera, but it wasn't something that I actively did. And it wasn't until much later, and my first trip was an archaeological trip that I was a part of to Peru, and I came back with photos, and people said, "Oh, these are good, you ought to do something with them." And I kept thinking, oh, they're just travel photos. And a couple of years later, I went on another trip, and I had people look at my work, and I was able to look at photos that other people had taken on this same trip. And I went, oh, yeah, okay, I don't have a telephone pole sticking out of someone's head. I looked at it a little different. And so that's kind of how it got started. The activism is much more, I would say, a recent activity. And I wouldn't say that it's something that I sought out. It's more that I feel compelled to speak out, and if that's what activism is, then that's what I'm doing. So,
well, I think your photos speak out as well.
Yeah,
I think they really tell
true.
a lot about people. What are some of the issues that you're concerned about that have led you to photograph what you photographed?
Well, when I travel, one of the things that I feel strongly is I often am in areas where most people are not necessarily going to go. And for some reason, and don't ask me why, I've always felt like it was important to come back and share my experience. And that sort of started it. And I love photographing people. I love experiencing places. So that was a beginning. My travels to Afghanistan and my love for Afghanistan came out of responding to September 11th and not liking what we were doing and feeling compelled to go and see for myself what was happening in Afghanistan. And that kind of is how it started. I had a high school classmate and her husband who'd been working in Afghanistan for a number of years, and I had dinner with them, probably hadn't seen them in like 15 years, and got very interested in what they were doing, and the program that it's the Littles, Tom Little and Libby Little, excuse me. And he was working on an eye care program, and the only eye care program in Afghanistan at that time. And I was very taken by his philosophy in the program that he was working with, which was more you teach a man to fish, and he will fish for the rest of his life, rather than giving them the fish and then he doesn't know what to do. And that was the way he was dealing with the eye care. He was training Afghans to take care of themselves and to do the eye care themselves, with the idea that if at any one time they had to leave, the program wouldn't just die. So, and also, the first time I went to Afghanistan, all I got to see was Kabul. And everyone said to me, if you haven't been out into rural areas, you haven't really seen Afghanistan. So I thought if I could travel with his team out into rural areas where they were doing eye care, then I would have a better idea of what Afghanistan was.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about Tom Little. He's the local ophthalmologist that was
Yes.
killed in Afghanistan. Was that in 2010? I can't remember.
2010. He, early on in I think it was in the 90s in Afghanistan, he served a very rural area of Afghanistan in the northeastern part of the country called Nuristan. It's a very different part of the country. It's mountainous, not like what you usually envision in Afghanistan, and there's trees, and it's kind of like a bowl of mountains, and he had served that area, and there's great need there because most other people never even get there, and he wanted to go back into that area. And so they had been trying to figure out how to take aid into that area because the main route was not safe to go on anymore. So they had to go up over a 16,000-foot pass into territory that was supposedly safe to travel in, and they had all the permissions from all the people that controlled the area, down to the Taliban knowing what they were doing there. And unfortunately, on the way back, after they'd gotten back from this trip and were stopping to have breakfast one morning after crossing over a stream, they were assassinated, really. And that's something that Tom and Libby always knew was a possibility, which is one of the things that's pretty amazing about them as people. And I think I learned a great deal from them and their attitudes toward aid and aid work, and not just handing things out to people, but finding out what they really needed and then doing it. Not doing things for people, but having them participate in it. And their dedication to their life as a life of service. And it's one of those things that philosophically I think I've gained a great deal from that in seeing my own life as a life of service. And my life of serving is different than theirs, but I still feel that that's part of what my life is about, is how can I help? How can I help, period. So...
Okay. Did you see the evidence and the results of 10 years of war in Afghanistan when you were there? Is it everywhere? Do you see it everywhere that you go? And what were your impressions?
You don't see it everywhere. In the first years that I was there, 2003, 4, and 5, it was very easy. I don't want to say easy. That makes it sound a little too... I could travel as a woman with his team, with a translator, and I felt relatively safe. Whenever I'm in a country like that, my radar is always out, but relatively safe, let's put it that way. I went back in 2009, excuse me, and then again in 2010, and I had a very, very hard time. And that was largely because what I saw was the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, the rural Afghans getting next to nothing, the warlords in power and not being very generous. I just saw all the wrong things being put into place there. The Afghans are incredibly friendly. They're incredibly resilient. They're beautiful people in their own way. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. We have a lot to offer them too, but we need to find out what it is they need rather than going in and giving them things. And aid is something that I think is very difficult because you create a false economy around the aid. And that's what I just saw, just blown way out of proportion when I was there. All of the businesses that want to support the foreigners that are there for the aid. So the houses, the rents of the houses go skyrocket. So your average Afghan can't afford it. But these businesses come in, these aid organizations who have the money to spend, the personnel that have the money to spend for housing. And so it creates, as there was an article in, I think, Atlantic about a year ago, and the gentleman who wrote the article talked about it as kabubble. And it was their housing bubble, that all of this economy that's built around the war industry and supporting our troops and everything else, it does not really help the Afghans figure out how to live their own lives. You're creating jobs that when we leave, those jobs are not going to be there anymore. And the young people are smart, and they've learned the computer skills that are necessary, and they get the good jobs. But once that's gone, the jobs are gone and they're not there. And we've created this whole economy that
Sort of a false economy.
around war.
Right, around
And
war.
like, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable to me.
No.
And it's not acceptable to the Afghans. Many of the Afghans are scared about what will happen when and if we leave. But many of them are also, like, they don't see their life being much better now than it was 12 years ago.
Maybe
yes,
even worse.
maybe the Taliban are not in power as such, but the Taliban are certainly in power in a lot of the country. And they don't want the Taliban, but yet at the same token, there was a certain amount of peace then. So you weigh these things, and supposedly we were making the women freer. So yes, there are more girls that are in school, so that is a good thing. But you have to educate the boys as well as the girls, because the girls in that culture will marry the boys. And if the boys are not educated or are not brought outside of the fundamentalist ideas, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference.
It's a big challenge.
So it's a challenge to figure out what would be best, or
Well, let's talk a little bit about your photographs. I think some of the best photographs that you've done, or at least the ones I like the most, are the ones that include children. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the photographs you took in Afghanistan of the children. And
it's always interesting to me, what does my eye catch? And kids are kids anywhere, and there is one photograph in the group that I think may be being shown in this of a girl with a red scarf around her neck, and I call her my green-eyed girl. Steve McCurry took the photograph of the Afghan woman on the National Geographic that probably everybody has seen.
I remember that.
So that was kind of my green-eyed girl. But she was a young girl in a internally displaced camp. And these are families that have left Afghanistan, and then they have chosen to come back for one reason or another. As refugees in another country, sometimes they kicked them out of the other country and said, your country is still there, go back home. Or people want to go back to their homes. It's their home. Once they get back to Kabul, maybe their land is no longer available to them, even though technically it is their land. They don't have deeds of ownership in the way that we have deeds of ownership. So there's very little way of proving this was my house. Someone else has taken that over and lived in it. So these people wind up any plot of ground that they can find, tents, and they live there. And it's pretty minimal. And friends had said to me at one point, that have traveled to Afghanistan, that is one of the poorest countries that they've ever seen. And I kind of thought about that, and it wouldn't be a way that I would describe Afghanistan at that time. It wouldn't have been. But as I've traveled other places more, I began to see that one of the reasons that Afghanistan is as poor as it is, or that it is one of the poorest, is that it has a horrible winter. So you have to deal with having winter clothes, and often these families don't have enough. So if they have a warm blanket or warm coats or shoes, often they get sold at the end of the winter for food so that they can eat. So then the next winter comes along and they're not prepared because unemployment is so great and they just don't have it. And whereas in Africa, if you go to Africa, not everywhere, but they don't have that same seasonal change, so they can be poor, but they can still eke out a living a little bit differently. They don't have to worry so much about staying warm and keeping their kids warm and things like that. So that's one of the tipping areas that I see. And it's really hard when you see these kids with little snotty noses and, dirt all over their face. And it's more than just the dirt of kids playing. And, maybe
Poverty.
One kid has a shoe and not a second shoe, but he's walking around with one shoe on. Just really dirty clothes that haven't been washed in quite some time, and it's kind of sad to see. But at the same token, you can look in these kids' eyes and you can see that they've seen a lot, but yet they're still there and they smile, and
They're kids.
you just want to love them.
Yeah. Well, I think your work is so important because they don't think the average American sees what it's like in Afghanistan. And your photos really do tell the story and show people the way they really are.
Well,
I think it's so important.
Thank you.
Well,
Most of what we see in the news, or have seen in the news, is you see the soldiers out in the deserty areas and these brown buildings, and there are really beautiful fruit trees and fruit groves and the valleys. It's a beautiful country, and if people love mountains, there certainly are more incredible mountains to climb. But I wouldn't do it until they've been cleared of landmines and things like that, But Afghanistan has a lot to offer if it could ever become a peaceful place.
Well, we're almost out of time here. We've got about 10 minutes, but let's talk a little bit about another trip that you made,
Okay.
and that's to Africa. And I wondered if you could tell us why you decided to go to Africa. What country did you go to?
Well, I went twice. I went to Ghana in 2012 and 2011, and then I went to Ghana, Benin, Togo, and Burkina Faso in 2012. And partially my reason for going to Africa, the opportunity came up. The church I belong to works in Ghana, and they were taking a trip, and part of it was paid, so it made it a lot easier to be able to do it. And when I went, I wanted to see, another sort of third world country and what it was like. And it was interesting to me the first time I was there. It was much more Christianized than I had expected. And one of the reasons I wanted to go back to that area again is a couple things. I never feel like the first time I've ever really seen the country. And I feel like my images may portray something, but I want more depth. I want to understand it better. And I wanted to understand, where were the traditional Africans? What I could see it in the church services, but what were their traditional ceremonies like? And so that was what the second time when I went back, I visited a number of the gentlemen we were traveling with. There were a number of voodoo ceremonies and so on that we visited. So I got a really different feel of the traditional Africa and the difficulties of creating that culture and keeping that culture alive at the same time as trying to be a part of the 21st century, which is a problem that many of these countries face. What do you keep? What do you give away? What do you lose? Those kinds of things.
Did you get the feeling maybe that sometimes you were photographing things that maybe would be gone someday soon,
Yes.
that things
Yeah.
are changing so rapidly in that area of the world? And really, is that the result of war in those areas too, or is it more industrialization and modernization?
I think it's more modernization, and I think unfortunately America has become a signpost for people of progress, and people want to emulate what we have, and I think that's a mistake. But you kind of have to try it out and learn before you realize that you've thrown the baby out with the bathwater sometimes. It's hard for me because I love seeing the old traditions, and some of the things that I see in some of these areas, I see very, very happy people. They may be poor, but they're happy. They don't have the same stress and everything else that we live with our lives. It's a toss-up. Which way do you go? I mean, you don't want to stop progress, but what really is progress?
That's a good question, isn't it?
And I don't have an answer for that. I don't think any of us
do.
do.
Right, I don't think we do. What was one thing about Africa that you found out that you don't think probably most Americans would know? What?
Well, the biggest surprise to me was around slavery and the issues of slavery, because I've always thought, oh, geez, we as Westerners brought slavery to Africa. And, excuse me, actually, slavery existed in Africa. And when foreigners came, the Africans could see that they could profit off of it, and that the Westerners pushed them to profit from it. But they had already, between tribes, been creating slaves between their own tribes. It got a whole lot worse when they saw that they could really profit from it. And that surprised me. I just kind of didn't realize that way.
Did you have a focus on what you were going to photograph when you went to Africa? Was there something that you specifically wanted to photograph?
Well, I think the ceremonies.
Okay.
And what was different for me this time is that I had camera that I could do video with.
Mm-hmm.
So I did do video as well as stills. I still haven't put that all together, but I think with the ceremonies it lends itself more to have the music and the sound and the actual movement as well.
I look forward to seeing those.
But I think again it was people, and how are we the same or different?
So let me ask you this: where will you go next?
Oh, I don't know. Friends of ours and I and my husband have wound up actually taking vacations rather than going and traveling to weird places. So we're looking at maybe going to, I'm just going to blank on where we're looking at going. Oh, isn't that terrible? Costa Rica for a couple weeks.
That should be nice. It'll be warm. Be good to get away.
Yeah, but I would love to get back to Afghanistan. I have a tendency to just keep wanting to go back and explore, and I feel I'm a much better photographer now than I was, and I'd like to have another crack at some things, So that's part of where it is for me. And I've fallen in love with the people. I want to see how they're doing. So.
Well, you've taken some wonderful photographs, and many of them are very memorable to me. I'll never forget the one with the women in the blue burqas and the doves. That is such a powerful, powerful photo.
Yeah.
As we wind this up, would you want to talk anything about any of the organizations that you've worked with, that if people wanted to get more involved or find out more about Noor, for example, how would they do that?
Oh, that's a tough one, because I think they have a website that if you go to the International Assistance Mission, and Noor is a part of that, and that's the I program that Tom was a part of, and many of the programs that he set up are still running. The organization that I've been donating to for the last few years and working with is the Afghan Women's Fund, the Women Against War group that I'm a part of. We built a well in a small village south of Kabul, and we are attempting to continue to raise funds for that village to pay for the teachers in the school that we started there, so that can keep going. And the easiest way to work with that is to contact me. You can do that through my website, and then I can connect people up with that, because I like to make sure that it goes to Mir Taki Shah, the village that we have, as opposed to just into their general pot for other programs. Not that wouldn't be a bad thing either, but
well, thank you. We're going to have to wind it up. For people who would like to see more of Connie's photos, if you Google Connie Houde, you'll find several articles about the work that Connie's done. She's had photographs all over the country in various galleries. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.